Hi everyone, so a little bit of interesting information I stumbled across today regarding the way that the eSRAM is working or intended to work with the Xbox One. Now this changes the game slightly. Now, it's fairly technical stuff, but here's how Microsoft have kind of envisaged developers making use of this eSRAM memory. Now, specifically, it requires DirectX 11.2 SDK, and that's being updated continuously from Microsoft. They may very well be on DirectX 11.3 or 4 by now for developers. But here is how this works. Traditionally, when you're building a game, one of the most intensive things you're going to be asking a game engine and a console to do is moving textures around the screen, or specifically rendering all of those textures. Now, traditionally, a developer will take all of the textures required for their particular game level, load it up into memory so it's nice and fast to be accessed by CPU, graphics cards, whatever needs to happen. Now, that does have some limitations. If you only have a certain amount of RAM, say you've got 4 gig, 5 gig, 8 gig, and you want to throw 10 gig of textures at it, well, you're out of luck. You're going to have to scale your textures back and change your approach. Now, this is where things get interesting. We've talked a lot about, the differences between the PS4 and the Xbox One's memory architecture. The PS4 essentially is going for a more cutting-edge approach using DDR5, and Microsoft took a different approach. They went with DDR3 and a piece of eSRAM memory. Now, this eSRAM memory is incredibly fast. It's faster than the memory that Sony is using in the PlayStation 4, but it's also more expensive, so you only include a very small amount. In Microsoft's case, they went for 32 meg. Now, I don't believe all that 32 meg is actually available for developers. I've heard around 26 to 28 meg is actually available for developers. The rest is being used by Windows to allow for things like the split screens and screen switching between TV and so on. Effectively the virtual machine element to keep that really, really fast and fluid. As you've noticed with the Xbox One, when you switch screens, it is really responsive. The eSRAM is being used for part of that. But anyway, onto the textures. Now, what Microsoft have come up with here is actually really clever. They've effectively taken a technique developers have been using in software for a fair old while as kind of a workaround for the limitations of memory within computers. So, normally, you would throw all those textures at a scene, and what you might do if you're feeling a little resource constrained is you might use something known as tiling, and otherwise known as partial resident textures. Now what this basically means is instead of throwing all of the textures in a scene, you load up just the ones that are going to be needed at the various depths that they are going to be seen. So for instance, you don't need a super high resolution texture for something that's like a road 400 yards away from you. It's not going to be seen at the highest fidelity anyway. However, as you get closer to that particular object, then the texture quality needs to increase. And that's where this kind of partial resident texture and tiling comes in. Essentially, what Microsoft have allowed developers to do is to take a sort of chunk of their textures, using this tiling system, place those directly into the eSRAM, and then make those available for processing by game engine, so on, throwing it at the screen, doing whatever needs to happen. Now, what Microsoft have achieved here is actually quite remarkable. They've essentially managed to take, using this technique, 3 gig of textures and, for all intents and purposes, place them into only 16 megabytes of eSRAM. Now, part of the problem here has been that this is a whole kind of new technique for developers. It's a cheat they used to use in software an awful lot. It wasn't very successful from a point of view because you're relying a lot more on the CPU to kind of have to do everything. Here, we've kind of got it baked directly into the software developer kit. Now, part of the problem Microsoft, I think, had at launch was effectively their software developer kit just wasn't ready in time. It wasn't as advanced, it wasn't as tuned, and it hadn't really been, let's just say, fleshed out enough in many respects to allow developers to really get in deep to use the eSRAM effectively. Plus, there is obviously a lot of work involved having to then create your textures for the tiling system instead. Now, partly this kind of shows why we've been having this resolution gate problem as well as frame rate issues as well, where developers are having to make a trade-off between, high frame rate or high resolution. Now, what this really, I think, means for Microsoft is that they're playing well behind the game at the moment. Technically, they do have the performance ability to push the same quality of textures at the same resolution as Sony is achieving today. The issue they've had is the software developer kit has effectively been lagging behind the hardware. You know, they've not been able to release, I suppose, the performance improvements to developers, as well as obviously software optimization, as well as they themselves get better used to the Xbox One. So the interesting thing really here for me is Microsoft have certainly not done themselves any favours over this kind of last year, really, since the Xbox One was first announced and really coming up to launch and post-launch. Maybe if they'd been a little bit more open and honest about how they were seeing this technology working from a developer's point of view, and not gagging developers from being able to kind of talk about how this has been working, then, you know, the communities would have a better understanding of how much power is in the Xbox One once it's tuned properly. I mean, this tiling stuff is pretty damn cool. It really is. You know, this is the kind of watershed technical innovation that we expect to see from Microsoft, yet effectively it's been buried in, well, developer documentation and a couple of briefings that were done at developer conferences. Not really the kind of thing. If you want to get out there and start talking about this technology, Microsoft, start talking about how you're using it, demonstrate how you used it with Forza 5 and so on. I don't see, if none of your competitors have this particular architecture running with the potential you've got here, I don't understand why you're effectively ducking and covering and not talking about it. You should be shouting this from the rooftops. You may very well have pulled off one of the greatest innovations in games consoles since Sony decided to build a PlayStation. Do you know what I mean? Yet there's no awareness of this out there really within the Xbox and PlayStation 4 communities. So here we go. I'm basically bringing this to the world now and saying, if you're not a developer, you probably didn't already know this, but Microsoft actually is back in the game. They may very well have the ability to pull developers along if they can get this tiling working really well for developers. If they can keep improving the SDK, then they may very well be back in the fight. But it's going to take time, and I'm afraid it may very well be we're waiting for the rest of the year before we really see the Xbox One catch up. Will it be able to overtake the PS4? That's an interesting one. Strictly speaking, there's around an extra 4 or 5% in the raw numbers from the eSRAM's performance improvement over DDR5, if used properly. But it all depends on whether Microsoft can actually unleash that power for developers at this point, and developers can take advantage of it. It's a real role reversal this time round from the kind of PlayStation 3 and Xbox One era, where effectively the PlayStation 3 was a complete nightmare to develop for developers. They constantly were having to come up with workarounds and tweaks and so on, where the Xbox One was very much a simple, port it from a PC kind of code base, slap it on, off we go, it's DirectX, awesome. Now we've kind of got very much a role reversal, where now it's a very straightforward pipeline between, you know, PC development tools and coming straight into the PlayStation 4 with marginal changes. On the Xbox One side, however, we've got a whole new architecture here, including a completely new way of dealing with textures that is going to take developers some time to really wrap their head around. So, I've made a lot of videos all about the Xbox One and, you know, its performance problems, but actually that's what you see really from the Xbox One today. But the potential for the Xbox One is now looking an awful lot more rosy. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video. Do please remember to like and comment, and if you'd like to, please subscribe. You can also visit our website and download our Android app. If you do subscribe, you'll be getting a daily dose of the latest tech news, hardware reviews, Android games, consoles, and basically an honest opinion direct from the UK. Stay tuned, stay Androidizen.